evolutionary consequences and the fosterage system. In fact, I think this cultural embrace of violence explains in evolutionary terms why the Norse grew bigger and stronger than many other Germanic tribes. In a society where physical prowess and the ability to defend one's honor are the primary metrics for survival and reproduction, the bigger and stronger naturally have the advantage. Look at it this way. Say I'm a Viking looking for a wife. I don't just want someone to cook and mind the kids while I'm away. When I'm off raiding in Northumbria, she needs to be able to run the farm and defend my homestead from rivals. I need a big, strong woman, one who can swing an axe, shoot a bow, and ride a horse if necessary. If I marry someone delicate, I'll come home one day to find my farm burned to the ground and my property gone. By choosing strong partners, the Vikings ensured they would bear big, strong children who could continue the cycle. Bottom line, in Viking society, it didn't matter if you were a thrall, a king, or a jarl. No matter who your father was, you were expected to know how to wield a sword and shield, and you had to train constantly. Their beliefs evolved from this reality. For a Viking, dying of old age in a warm bed was considered a straw death, dishonorable and weak. A good death, a glorious death, came on the battlefield with a weapon in hand which would earn you a place in Valhalla or Folkvanger. Because of this focus on the clan rather than the individual, there was no modern idea of a nuclear family. The more children and relatives you had, the more powerful your household was. To consolidate power, it was common practice to send boys to their uncles or other high-ranking relatives to be raised as foster children. This way, families within a clan could intertwine their loyalties. The family was the fundamental unit of warfare. Take me, for example. I have 4 sons, but my brother only has 1. He needs a strong heir to protect his lands. Meanwhile, I'm struggling to manage 4 rowdy boys who are constantly causing trouble in the village, harassing the women by the river, or stealing food. The community has had enough. So, I decide to give one of them to my brother, to raise as his own. His family line is secured, my brother's household is strengthened, and I have 1 less mouth to feed. It was a perfect system for building a warrior network. Chapter 8. The Viking Age begins. The shadow of the dragon. So, how did the Viking Age truly begin? This era, defined by Scandinavian expansion, spanned from the late 8th to the mid-11th century. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles first record a significant event in 789 A.D., when 3 ships landed in southern Britain, and the men aboard killed a king's reeve who had come to collect taxes. But the true terror from the north began with the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. The Vikings began by relentlessly raiding England's coastal regions. They specifically targeted churches and monasteries, a logical strategic choice. These places were often poorly defended, yet they held vast stores of silver, gold, and grain. To a pagan Viking, a monastery wasn't a holy place. It was essentially a bank without guards. Similar raids were recorded across Europe, in Ireland, France, and even as far as the Mediterranean around this time. But the nature of these attacks changed in 865 A.D. This was the year the Great Viking Army, or the Great Heathen Army, landed in the Kingdom of East Anglia. Don't let the name Great Viking Army fool you into thinking they were a modern military force. They weren't like the swift Turk-Mongol hordes which moved in locust-like swarms of 30 to 40,000 men. Historians estimate the great Viking army was actually quite small, perhaps only about 1,000 to 2,000 men. With the ships of that era, moving tens of thousands of troops across the North Sea was simply not feasible. So why were they so feared across the entire continent? The reason is simple. They came out of nowhere. They utilized their ships to strike with surgical precision. They would loot everything: grain, silver, women, and slaves. They did not follow the established rules of war that Christian Europe observed. For instance, in Christian warfare, priests and churches were normally considered off-limits. The Vikings, however, saw priests only as valuable slaves. They carried out horrific massacres that shattered the morale of their enemies. Feudal kings were also no match for these men's speed. To wage a traditional war, a Frankish or Saxon king would need 3 to 4 months to summon his lords, who in turn had to muster their peasants. By the time the main army arrived, the Vikings had already swept in, taken everything of value, and sailed away. They were masters of the hit-and-run tactic. Furthermore, the Vikings were facing a Christian society made up largely of serfs who were forbidden from carrying weapons. The Vikings, on the other hand, were pagans who lived and breathed for battle. Their fearsome appearance, their intricate tattoos, their wolf pelt clothing, and the terrifying war paint they wore were utterly overwhelming. In the minds of the Europeans, the Vikings were transformed into theological monsters. Many in the early Viking age didn't even believe they were human. Picture this. You're a simple farmer in a sackcloth, holding a sickle. Suddenly, a 6-foot-tall man in a wolf pelt, howling like a beast and charging with 2 massive axes, appears out of the mist. Naturally, you'd be terrified, thinking, "What the hell is this? Is this the apocalypse?" Europeans would later demonize the Turks and the Mongols in the same way. It's a classic psychological tactic. You dehumanize the other side, branding them as infidels or monsters to explain your own defeat. Chapter 9. The Social Impact of Violence and Sexuality. As I discussed in my History of Sexuality video, civilization generally requires moving violence and sexuality out of the public sphere and into private, regulated spaces. But for the Vikings, violence remained very public and very formalized. And in some ways, so did sexuality and social hierarchy. When these men, steeped in a culture of extreme personal honor and violence, clashed with more peaceful, hierarchical, and civilized societies, the result was a horrific cultural shock. Most Viking raids and expeditions weren't actually ordered by a central king. They were private ventures. This meant that when a Saxon king encountered a Viking warband, he had to negotiate directly with its specific leader. This made lasting agreements almost impossible. You might pay off one war clan with Danagild, gold, to make them go away, only for another clan to show up the very next week and raid the same village. You couldn't solve things with centralized diplomacy because the Viking state didn't exist in a way that Europeans understood. So why did the Viking kings allow these warrior bands, mostly made up of independent Bandi, to go off raiding on their own? Wouldn't it be more profitable for a king to lead a full-scale organized invasion himself? Actually, no. Viking kings were very clever. If too many ambitious Bandi gathered in Scandinavia, they would eventually start demanding more land and more power for their own families. Suddenly, as king, you'd find yourself competing with thousands of armed, restless men. A king's power in the north came not from a sacred bloodline, but from his personal strength. There were no rigid barriers. A bold Viking could even challenge a jarl to single combat and claim his title outright. So the king encouraged them to leave. It thinned his ranks. Yes, some died raiding, but it also purged his lands of thousands of bloodthirsty psychopaths who might otherwise have started a civil war against him. Furthermore, when the Bondi abandoned their small rocky lands in Scandinavia to seek new settlements in England or France, the king could easily move in and claim their old territory for himself, centralizing his power at home. Chapter 10. Fragmentation and the Norman Solution. But this initial advantage of fragmentation would later backfire on the Vikings. In their newly conquered territories, such as the Danelaw in England, they began fighting amongst themselves. Without a central authority, they gave rise to numerous petty kings, each ruling a small town or a few fields. The Franks and Saxons, being more organized, eventually exploited this political disunity. For instance, while the sagas say the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok was killed in a snake pit by the Saxon king Aelle, some historians argue that he, or a figure like him, was actually slain by a rival Norwegian king in Ireland. The Vikings were their own worst enemies. Some Viking clans eventually realized they could get more wealth by switching sides. They accepted money and land from the Saxons or Franks, converted to Christianity, at least on the surface, and fought against other Viking raiders. The Franks, however, adopted a far more radical and successful approach. In 845 A.D., the Vikings tried to besiege and take Paris. They were paid off with a massive amount of silver to leave, but they kept coming back. According to the sagas, while the main force returned home, a powerful chieftain named Rollo remained in France with his clan, continuing to raid the countryside. In 911 A.D., wearied by these constant northern raiders, King Charles the Simple of France made a bold move. He granted Rollo and his men the land at the mouth of the Seine, what we now call Normandy. Rollo reached an agreement. He would swear fealty to the Frankish king, convert to Christianity, and in return, he would become the Duke of Normandy. His job was to serve as a Viking shield, protecting France from any other Vikings coming up the river. This was a masterstroke of logic. It worked so well that by 1066, the Norman French army led by Rollo's descendant, Duke William the Conqueror, would cross the Channel and conquer England, ending the Anglo-Saxon era forever. The Vikings' politically fragmented structure, which made them so hard to defeat initially, led to their eventual absorption into the European feudal system. Chapter 11. The Global Reach, from Istanbul to America. When the Viking Age ended at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, did these northerners simply vanish? Of course not. They had already integrated themselves into the fabric of the world. For instance, in 860 A.D., they attempted to conquer Constantinople, Istanbul. The Byzantine emperor, seeing these Varangians coming across the Black Sea, was terrified, but also deeply impressed. Even though the raid was driven back, he realized these men were the greatest warriors he had ever seen. Eventually, the Norse became the Byzantine emperor's personal imperial bodyguard, known as the Varangian Guard. Historical records show that these Scandinavians served as the elite secret service for emperors for centuries. They were famous for their loyalty, since they had no local political ties, and their massive two-handed axes. If you visit the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul today, you can still see Viking graffiti carved into the marble railings of the upper gallery, runes that say things like Halfdan was here. In Russia, the Norse, the Rus, continued to rule as the Rurik dynasty until the late 16th century. They eventually abandoned the life of piracy and transitioned into roles as elite mercenaries, merchants, and explorers. These guys traveled extensively, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar and mingling in the Islamic world. There are accounts of Vikings in the markets of Baghdad, trading furs and slaves for Arabian silver. Let's talk about the sheer scale of Viking exploration. We know for a fact that these people were the first Europeans to reach Greenland and establish lasting colonies there. The story of Eric the Red is one of history's most ironic jokes. After being exiled from Iceland for murder, he found a frozen, desolate island. To attract settlers, he named it Greenland, the medieval equivalent of finding a wasteland in the middle of the desert and naming it Wetland to sell real estate. It worked. Thousands of people moved there. On the other hand, the Vikings were also the first Europeans to reach North America, 500 years before Columbus. For a long time, the Viking sagas about Vinland, the land of wine, were viewed by historians as mere myths. However, this was proven true in 1960 when the remains of a Norse settlement were discovered at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. How did they get there? They didn't cross the vast, open Atlantic Ocean in one go like Columbus did. They hopped across the north, using the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland as gas stations. The route was much shorter and safer for their style of ships. They named the region Vinland because of the wild grapes they found, but they ultimately lost their struggle to maintain a colony there. They were simply too far from home, and they were vastly outnumbered by the Skraelings, the Native Americans. The sagas even detail the specific battles they fought with the natives. If they had managed to maintain that colony, the entire history of the world would look different today. Chapter 12. The Secret of the Steppe Horses of the Sea. So what truly made the Viking ships so special? It wasn't just the wood or the sails, it was the philosophy of their design. These ships were capable of navigating both the deep, rough waters of the Atlantic and the shallow, winding rivers of the European interior. They were both fast and highly maneuverable. They built separate types of ships for different purposes. The Snecke for war, which were thin and fast, and the Knar for trade, which had larger, deeper hulls to hold cargo. But when it came to the actual shipbuilding techniques, they were centuries ahead of their neighbors. They used radial splitting to cut their timber, which preserved the natural strength of the wood fibers, making their planks much stronger than the sawn timber used by the Franks. In short, Viking ships were the steppe horses of the sea. Just as the horse gave the nomads of Central Asia an unbeatable tactical advantage on land, the ship gave the Vikings an unbeatable advantage on the water. Conclusion: the legacy of the North. The Viking Age didn't end because the Vikings were defeated in a single battle. It ended because they became victims of their own success. They settled the lands they raided, they became the kings and dukes of the people they once plundered, and they slowly adopted the religion and languages of their new homes. From the fjords of Norway to the sun-drenched halls of Constantinople, the Vikings left an indelible mark on the world. They were not just psychopaths with axes. They were complex, legalistic, family-oriented, and technologically brilliant people who refused to be confined by the boundaries of their harsh northern home. They were the bridge between the ancient pagan world and the medieval Christian one. And through their DNA, their laws, and their words, words like thing, sky, window, and husband, the Vikings are still very much with us today.